Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, outfitting your fantasy knife making shop. So I get emails all the time from guys who want to start making knives and, they need to outfit their shop and they're always like, well, I only have $100 to spend. Well, I got a note from a Patreon subscriber recently who has a much more fun challenge for me. He said, hey, look, I've got 15, 20K to spend. I really want to dive into this thing. Can you tell me how to outfit a shop that, is going to be really kind of cover all the bases for me? So he didn't want to just know the tools, but he also wanted to know the specific brands, the models, the part numbers, all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to give a, right down to the model number of every single one of these, but I'll try and do it. Now, of course, I haven't used every single solitary tool on the planet, so a lot of this is just kind of based on my own personal experience and what I've got in my shop. So with that caveat, let's jump on in. All right, so let me start with forge tools. First thing is the anvil. Buy an anvil that's at least 150 pounds. Now, in this case, the brand's not really important, the model number or whatever. The most important thing is that it must have a hardened steel face. There are cast iron anvils available out there. You don't want to use those for knife making. But most of the models that they're going to sell at farrier supply places, blacksmithing supply places, places like Centaur Forge should work fine. General note on forge tools: again, you can buy pretty much all of them at places like Centaur Forge, and there are other blacksmithing supply places that are good and reputable too. But another great source to buy forge tools from is at blacksmithing conventions and hammer-ins of knife makers and things like that. A lot of times you'll have guys who will set up little booths and they'll sell tools that they've made or that they've sourced. And, you get a chance to sit there and talk to them and say, hey, I'm looking for this and I'm going to be doing this or that or the other, and they can give you good recommendations. So with that said, I would buy a set of 1-inch box jaw tongs and a set of 1 1/4-inch box jaw tongs. Box jaw tongs are really important for anybody that's using rectangular stock, which is basically what knife makers are using pretty much all the time. I'd also buy standard pickup tongs and wolf jaw tongs. Now after that, everything's kind of a special use item and you'll just sort of have to figure it out as you go. There are tons and tons of special use tongs that are really designed just to clamp down on one very, very specific kind of thing. And there's no use in loading up on thousands of those kinds of tongs if you're only going to use them once in a blue moon. Better to just source those every time you need them. You'll also want to buy kind of your standard blacksmithing hammer. Again, brand's not important. You can buy one down at Home Depot if you want, or you can buy them, in many different patterns, French pattern and just various other kinds of things from blacksmithing supply places. 2.5 pounds is kind of the standard, and that's a good weight for most folks. Now, I made my own forge, so I'm working a little bit from things that other people have told me, but I would buy one of the NC Tool Whisper model propane forges. Don't buy the open-sided farriers forges. You need doors and ports on the ends. I would also recommend buying a high-quality 2-gauge propane regulator to go with it. Don't buy an acetylene regulator. The propane ones are not way more expensive. But they're specifically made for propane and they can go up to a higher pressure than the acetylene ones. Buy a good brand like Victor. Again, the part number's not that crucial, but Victor just is one of the best known brands of regulators, and they sell one specifically for propane. That's what I would use. Also, buy yourself a big propane tank so you don't have to go back and forth to Home Depot all the time to fill up your barbecue tanks. I'd also buy an even heat 18-inch Knifemaker's heat treating oven. Those are electric heat treating ovens. You can buy smaller ones, which are obviously more economical to operate, but if you make a big Bowie or a Sachs or something like that that's kind of longish, it might not fit in the smaller sort of 12-inch types, and there are even smaller ones than that if you want. It's a little more expensive to run them, obviously, because you're putting more electricity into them, but you won't have that thing where you make something and then you put it in there and realize you can't heat treat it. So power hammers and presses, hydraulic forge presses, basically do the same thing. They just squash stuff down. Presses, as a general rule, are way cheaper. So personally, I would recommend, if you're just going to get one of the two, I would get the press first. You can buy a 24-ton hydraulic press. I have a Riverside machine, Uncle Al machine. I really wouldn't hesitate to recommend one of those. It's a 24-ton. If you can buy a 50-ton, if that'll fit into your budget, that gives you even more room to play. The key thing here with forge presses is that you want to buy a two-stage machine, meaning that as you're pushing on the little treadle that triggers it, you can make the ram move fast or slow depending on how fast you or how far you depress the pedal. Now, personally, I don't have a power hammer myself. My shop's not in what you'd call a power hammer friendly location. Like I said, the Nasal B3 is the big name power hammer, kind of the fantasy power hammer, and that'll eat up your budget real fast. The Big Blue pneumatic is probably more cost effective, and there's some other brands made too. Again, I don't have much experience with those myself. Now, an interesting thing is recently some guys have been making tire type rotary hammers that are much cheaper than the big pneumatics. And they seem to work pretty well too, so that's a good option. I tried one of these recently at the Florida Artist Blacksmithing Convention this summer, and it worked great, and they're way cheaper than the big pneumatics. Basically, they use the same kind of principle as Little Giant power hammers, the old power hammers that they don't make anymore, that turn rotary motion into a reciprocating motion. The one that I tried out really seemed to work pretty well, so and it wasn't super expensive, so that's something to consider. As far as brands on those go, it seems like those are mostly kind of made in a backyard sort of way. Some of the guys in the Florida Artist Blacksmithing Association had made a few, but I don't know that they're making them on a regular basis. All right, so let's talk grinders. The belt grinder is just the absolute foundational tool of knife making. If you're going to spend money, the best place to put that money is towards a really good grinder. The more mass, the more rigidity, the better the motors are, the more it's going to last, and the higher the quality of the knives that you make off it are going to be. If you're trying to chase a jiggling, rattling kind of machine around, it's really going to hurt your ability to make good quality grinds. So spending money on grinders is worth every penny. I might even recommend buying two. So that said, the Bader B3 is what I use. Absolutely fantastic machine. I would unhesitatingly recommend that. A lot of people these days are using the Travis Wirtz TW90, and kind of there's a bunch of sort of similar ones, and they can articulate and do a lot of things in terms of changing orientation of the face and stuff like that the B3 cannot, that the Bader can't. Now, I haven't used them a lot, but it's a real ingenious design, and my perception is that it's not quite as rigid as the Bader. Still, a lot of people are using them and really enjoying them. If I were going to get the Wirtz, I would buy a surface grinder attachment for it. Unless you still have enough money left in the budget to buy a surface grinder. Surface grinders are really handy machines. They basically just flatten things out to a very high degree of precision. Used 6x12-inch manual models, and Herrig is probably the most frequently available, but there are tons of other brands out there. You can find those on eBay for around $2,000, sometimes even cheaper than that. If you're using them for certain kinds of knife making, say making folders, you may want one that's really in good condition and that'll really give you good flats. But if you're forging, you may not need crazy levels of flatness, and one that's a little bit worn and the tolerances aren't as good on still might be great for you if you're really concentrating on forging and you just want to, say, flatten out Damascus billets or something like that. Another great option if you're interested in surface grinders is the Tormach. It's power driven, so you can set things and kind of walk away from it, which is really nice, because sitting here twiddling the wheels all day on a manual machine is really going to take a lot of time. So while we're on the subject of grinders, a disc grinder is also really a handy tool in the knife making shop. I've got a 12-inch Grizzly. That means the face of that disc is 12 inches wide. For a fantasy shop, I wouldn't go any smaller than that, though they do make them much smaller. The Grizzly that I have is not, crazy high end, but it's a good solid model. Again, I wouldn't stress a great deal on the brand here, Enco and some other Jets. Some other companies make these kind of in the $200-300 range that are very stable, good quality machines, but again, not crazy expensive. All right, so let's turn to just kind of general tools for the shop. Drill press, really important. I'd buy a freestanding model rather than the bench model, but that's not that critical. Half-inch chucks and half-horse motors are good, but again, you can go a little smaller. A 3/8-inch chuck is fine. Brand's not all that important. You can get decent Jet and Enco type machines. They're around $1,000 new, and that's for a big, fairly industrial-ish kind of floor standing model. But you can also buy like old Craftsman and stuff like that for $200 on Craigslist, used ones. And so that's a pretty good way to go too. A lot of times people will buy these machines, they'll sit them out there in their shop, hardly ever use them. They're in great shape, and you can have them for, a tenth of what you'd, maybe not a tenth, but you can have them for a lot cheaper than it would cost to buy them new. Obviously, if you're buying used, you want to make sure that the motor works and the spindle's turning smoothly and there's no oscillation or anything. But other than that, used is not a bad way to go. There are a bunch of different woodworking tools that are really handy to have. Personally, I would recommend getting a 14-inch floor mount type bandsaw. Grizzly makes a pretty solid one, but again, Enco and Jet, and there are a bunch of other these kind of mid-market type ones that are nice. Obviously, you can buy really high-end ones too, but that's even going to eat up the fantasy budget. So, to me, that kind of sweet spot is those machines that are kind of in the $700-800 range, 14-inch bandsaws. I'd also buy a radial arm saw or a chop saw and a table saw. Brand's not all that important. The DeWalt level kind of things, or Milwaukee or whatever that you can buy from Home Depot, those are plenty high quality for a knife maker's shop. You'll be using them, but it's not like you're a carpenter where you're going to be using them all day. The just basic mid-market things will do you fine. Now, as far as metalworking machines go, the first thing you're going to need is just something to chop metal with. A 12-inch abrasive chop saw is, kind of my go-to thing. Again, brand's not all that important. Just stay away from the Harbor Freight type stuff. But DeWalt, Milwaukee, again, a bunch of those kinds of middle market, prosumerish type models are available out there that'll work just fine. Also, if you have the budget, I would buy a metal cutting bandsaw, but if you're weighing the two, even with $20,000 to spend, you're not going to be able to buy every single tool ever made. And personally, I think that the chop saw is a little bit more of a value than the bandsaw. Now, bandsaws can do a lot more things, but you have to pay a lot more in order to get a high quality bandsaw. Ideally, you want one that you can use vertically or horizontally. That way you can use it kind of like you'd use your old bandsaw, wood cutting bandsaw, to cut out complicated shapes and so forth. The main advantage of the bandsaw over a chop saw is that you can cut deeper pieces, you can cut more complicated shapes and that sort of thing. But unless you're doing a lot of complicated shapes, most knife makers are just cutting off stock. So of the two, you're getting a lot more bang for your buck with the chop saw. A mill is a really handy tool around the shop. I would probably buy a used Bridgeport. You can find those on eBay for a couple $1,000s. An alternative to that is to buy a mill drill, again, Enco, Grizzly. There are all kinds of those sort of middle market Chinese-ish type brands that you spend maybe $3,000-$4,000 on. The most important thing with any mill is I would recommend getting a DRO, digital readout. I bought my mill a long time ago, and I didn't have a digital readout, and twiddling those knobs and doing a little calculations of how far you're moving everything is a giant pain in the neck. It's doable, but I would recommend getting the DRO, and you won't be sorry you spent that money. The only thing I would mention about buying used Bridgeport is typically those are going to be three-phase, so you'll also need to budget a phase converter or a VFD. So beyond that, there's obviously a lot of just random tooling, hacksaws, socket sets, Allen wrenches, screwdrivers. That just goes on and on. I mean, personally, I go to Home Depot or Lowe's or, you know, Ace Hardware or something probably 2-3 times a week. You just never have enough tools, and there's always something that comes up that you want some little special thing for. But a couple things that I would mention in that kind of general realm. Obviously, you got to have files. A hacksaw is really useful, and digital calipers. I use them all the time. You can buy the $30 ones and they'll work fine. They won't last as long as the $150 Mitutoyos, but you can buy 5 of them for the same price. Last word, clamps. Welding clamps, squeeze clamps, bar clamps, C-clamps. I mean, there are an endless number of different kinds of clamps. You could go to Lowe's, fill your cart with clamps, and you'll still wish you had more. And of course, there are all kinds of specialty clamps that you can buy from MSC or Grainger or whatever. Can't twist clamps. I mean, they're just endless numbers of different kinds of clamps. Never have enough of them. All right, so I hope you had fun with that. Even if you haven't got $20,000 to spend, I'm a big believer in aspiration. You know, if you are interested in something, a lot of times I'll say, I want to get one of those things, and it might be 5 years before I get it. I'm a patient guy. I know everybody's not as patient as I am, but having these little things in your mind plants the seed for things that you'll need to do further down the line, and it's always fun to have them in the back of your mind and thinking, okay, one of these days I'm going to get that widget that I really, really want. All right, guys, thanks for watching, and hope you had fun with that. Thanks for watching, guys. If you feel like you got something out of this video, don't forget to subscribe. Also, click on the link to Patreon for a great way to give back to the channel. Plus, check me out on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Links in the description. If you want something sharp and pointy, maybe a gift for yourself or one of the cooler people in your life, check out my Tactics Armory website and pick up one of our tactical or outdoor knives. And finally, if you want to learn to make hamones or Japanese swords, check out WalterSorrellsBlades.com, where you can find videos about how I make hamones, as well as forging, mounting, polishing, and fittings for Japanese swords. Thanks, and see you soon.